All right, y'all. Well, what's up? What's up? Y'all know the vibes. It's your boy Cam, and I am excited to introduce y'all to the three most important things you're going to need to set up in your developer environment to start working on some full stack projects. And the reality is that being a full stack engineer requires you to utilize your computer in some really interesting ways, right? We write code on it. We got to organize the code that we're writing, and we got to deploy the code and make sure that we can see the code on our websites, or send the code to our teammates, etc. So today I want to talk about the three things that you're going to need to do in order to have a solid developer environment. And those three things are having the ability to organize your code files. Second thing is being able to write those code files. And then the third thing is being able to store them and use version control to manage them. So those are the three things, and we're going to just dive right in. So first things first, let's talk about code organization and code collaboration. So my screen's loading, but first thing I wanted to introduce is GitHub, right? And so show of thumbs, I'm sure majority of folks here have probably heard of GitHub or have seen it at some point. Give me a thumbs up if you've seen or heard about GitHub at one point. So GitHub is a tool for developer collaboration, right? We utilize GitHub for the sake of creating all of our code projects and storing them in ways that we can use to later collaborate with people. But GitHub is just a part of the puzzle, right? In order to have a project on GitHub, you need to actually have a project, right? And so whether you're a business like Target and you're pushing code as a corporation, or whether you are an individual like my homie Bobby who's creating projects yourself, right? You might need to organize those projects in a way that you can further get reference to later, and that's what GitHub is for. So everything in relationship to being a full stack developer doesn't necessarily start with Git and GitHub. It actually starts with a simple project. So let's take it all the way back into the beginning, right? So the first thing you're going to end up doing as a developer is building projects, right? And so as you can see here, my desktop is already kind of full of different files and different folders of different files. So let me just kind of stop this share and share again. My desktop has got a lot of things going on in it, right? And so as an engineer, some of these you can see are some projects like, oh, this design pad project, or like my taxes. Those aren't projects, but you get the vibe, right? Projects. The first thing you're going to need as an engineer is a clean place to store your projects, because if you don't have a clean place to store your projects, things get cluttered. It's hard to figure out where things are, and it's hard to manage the projects later, right? So the first thing I like to do when I'm working on a new developer environment, like let's say I wiped my computer today and I wanted to start over. The first thing I would do when it came time to like start building my projects out is create a project-based folder that I'm gonna save all my projects in, so I know, hey, all my work or education work related projects or code projects are in one place, right? So you could do that a number of ways, right? If, on your desktop, you could create a new folder and just be like, hey, this is gonna be my new project folder on my desktop. Sometimes I like, because most times we're gonna end up using command line tools and working on the terminal, I like to create a folder inside of the terminal. But for the sake of right now, let's say I create a new folder right now and I'm just like, hey, this new folder is going to be called, this new folder is going to be my, code projects, right? Like, it's that simple, right? And inside of this folder, right, I can start using it to be more particular about how I'm going to organize those particular files. So if I open this code projects folder inside of my my Finder, right, I have, as you can see, like nothing in there. But ultimately, right, there might be new projects in there, right? So maybe I have a project folder inside of here for like all of the CMP 464 projects I'm going to be doing as I'm live streaming for this class. Or maybe I'm going to have another folder for, the stuff I'm doing in the lab. So like I can have Floreo, right? Like ultimately organizing myself like this is only going to help me, right? Because now I know, hey, where is that project I was working on? Well, it's in the code projects folder, in that particular folder for the class. And like, maybe this is like project 0, my onboarding stuff, kind of thing, right? And then that might be where I actually start doing my code, right? And that is important because having a clear file system for where you're going to be putting your code is just as important as writing the code and managing the code on GitHub in the long run, right? Just being organized is important. So first thing I try to encourage folks to do is organize yourself with a solid project-based folder that you can save all your related projects in, right? However you do it, it doesn't really matter so long as you know, hey, I have one folder that I'm going to use to manage all these projects. In this case, for this class, this might be this CMP 464 particular folder, where each of these particular folders inside might be their own projects that I'm going to be working on, right? So one particular project that I might be working on is, you know, intro to HTML or something, right? And inside of here, this is now the project folder for whatever file or whatever project this turns out to be, right? So organizing yourself like this is important. And I'm about to show you why. Because the next thing you need to do in order to have a solid developer environment is you need to write project files, right? And so I particularly want to caveat and say that there's a number of different ways to write developer files, right? Different languages, different operating systems, different end devices. Like if you're writing a project for iOS, you need a different set of tools than if you're writing a project for full stack, right? So whichever particular end project you're going to be building, you got to know and study what types of tools are you going to need. But across the board, no matter what projects you're going to be working on, whether it's full stack, whether it's mobile, whether it's a embedded systems app and you're doing something with hardware, you're going to need a code editor of some kind, right? And a code editor is really just the place in which you're going to write the files that become the part of your project, right? So I have an organization, I have a folder, step one is complete. The next step is actually writing files that are going to be the files that I use for this particular project. And so that's where a code editor or a text editor comes in, depending on the environment. Some tools have their own code editors or developer environments that you can use. Some you just kind of write your own files and then you use those files to run the code yourself. And so for a full stack application, I just had this, I lost it. For a full stack application, one of the code editors I like the most is Visual Studio Code, which is a Microsoft-based coding editor that is really simple in the sense that it just provides you the ability to write files, open folders, and then it also has some really cool features that I particularly like and recommend to people, like an embedded terminal. So you don't have to find like, oh, how am I going to find this particular folder when I need to run my commands? Like you could do those very easily in VS Code. So if you are interested in a code editor, I don't get paid at all to recommend VS Code, but VS Code is the one I use. I've used Sublime Text before. I've used some Python specific ones like PyCharm. I've used Java specific ones like IntelliJ, etc. And like, you know, those language specific code editors are helpful, but they kind of get limited in that they work really well for one particular type of code language and not for all of them. VS Code is a great choice because it works for many different coding languages, and you can download extensions onto VS Code that make your developer environment for that language even better. So some other ones that are good outside of VS Code is like Atom. I see a lot of people have been using Atom, Sublime Text. I used to use Sublime Text, but Sublime Text was like VS Code's like pretentious brother that didn't have any extensions. Like, I love Sublime Text, but then everybody was like, dang, you kind of basic using Sublime Text. But I use VS Code now because it has the extensions, it has everything I need in a developer code editor, and then some, right? Like I really just need the code editor to write the files. But at the end of the day, VS Code allows me to write the files and then do things with those written files, which makes my life easier. So I'll show you what I mean right now. So after you download something like VS Code onto your machine, and again, I'll drop a link so that y'all can download this yourself if you need one, or if you have one, great, you can use that. But the idea is this, right? So to go back a step, we had to organize our files, we had to organize our folders. So if somebody were to ask me, hey, you know, I want you to build like that intro to HTML web page that you're going to be working on, right? I always have a folder for the project, no matter what. The project folder is here. Intro to HTML, right? Even if I'm only going to have one file in it, I like to organize it in folders because of this very important reason right here. with this being organized as a folder, it makes it very easy for me to launch it in like my code editor and save my work in the right place for me to run and use later and save later. So what I typically do, right, there's a couple ways I can do this, but what I typically do is open this folder that is going to hold my project work in my code editor. So in this case, like I would want intro to HTML to open in VS Code. Two ways to do this. One way is to open VS Code itself. And in VS Code, I can open that particular, folder. I can open a new, I think I got to do open folder and then find this folder, intro to HTML, and then open that up in VS Code when my computer goes with the flow. So let's see. Y'all seeing a glimpse into my life right here. So code projects, right? That's my big main folder. Inside of here, I have that folder for all of our class stuff, my particular folder for maybe this week. And then here's the project folder that I'm looking to actually open. So I would open this folder, and this will open a VS Code window with that particular folder and its files inside of it. And so that's helpful because once I start adding new files and saving new files, I want it to save in that folder. So opening it here to that folder just makes my life hella easy when it comes to a bunch of the different things I'm going to need to do to manage the files inside of this particular project. So all my started projects will start like this, typically a folder that's open, and I don't have any files in here, or I've made a couple files and I open this folder up to see those files later. So that's step two, is you gotta have the ability to open your folder with the files that you're gonna work on. Joy just put in the chat, there's also the code dot extension to open from the terminal. That is actually the command I use to open this folder into VS Code. It makes my life also very easy. Essentially, like we're talking about, VS Code has a number of different extensions and also some commands you can install to your computer to make it even easier for you to open a folder in VS Code. So Joy, you're onto something there. Maybe we can drop a link to how to do that, or we can explore that in a second video at a different point. But yeah, step one, make the folder. Step two, open the folder in your code editor. That's all you got to do. And if you did those three things, you're like two or three steps of the way to being an engineer. You know what I'm saying? Like those are the two. If you can't do those two things, we got to reevaluate some things. You know what I'm saying? Like those two things are really important. So if you can do those two things, we're good. So now the third thing clearly is like working on the actual files and managing the files you're working on in that sense. So let's say this is an HTML project. One of the things I love to do and why I like VS Code is because now I have some really cool shortcuts to create files and work with files, create folders, etc. in VS Code. So in VS Code, like not to become a VS Code snob, because again, they do not pay me for this yet. But so in the meantime, right, I got to create some files for myself. That's just the name of the game. So VS Code makes it easy for me to create files. I could either click this button right here, and this will create a new file for me. I just got to give it a name, or I could go to File, create a new file here, and it'll also ask me for a name. Same thing with folders. If I want a new folder, I could create a folder by clicking this, or again, I could create File, and then I think there's a way to add a folder, right? So all those things. But for the sake of just showing you what it is like working with these files and folders and stuff, next thing I would do, specifically in the full stack context, right? I need some HTML, because HTML is the bread and butter of like a web application. So I might start a new file like index.html. And as you can see, VS Code does some cool stuff for me that makes my life very easy, right? Like the first thing is it recognizes that the file extension, so dot blah, 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 is an HTML file, right? And it automatically makes itself ready to receive HTML file code. And that helps you because then it can detect like, hey, you know, you're working with an HTML file. It also can recommend certain extensions for HTML. You can also add into VS Code some extensions that help you like edit a file to look for errors in your syntax and stuff like that. So VS Code is dope because you can use it to customize to the language your file is written in. And you can have a project with multiple languages of files and then use VS Code to still write those particular files and then edit them, etc. If you wanted to change the file type, right? Again, VS Code will look at the dot whatever for the extension of the file, but you can also here at the bottom, change the file type here. And as you can see, there are a number of different languages that VS Code is already set up to be able to use, right? Just kind of scrolling through here for people to see, right? So in this particular series of videos where I'm streaming on, I'm going to be talking a lot about HTML, right? Which is here. Going to be talking a lot about JavaScript and JSX, right? JavaScript for regular JavaScript projects, JSX for the React stuff we'll be working on. We definitely will talk about JSON, which is here. CSS, I'm sure was above here somewhere, right? Yep, CSS, right? So all these things are here. And then of course, if you start getting a more full stack stuff, you might be using a bunch of these other things. And so it's helpful to use a code editor that will be able to adapt to what you're working on, and you don't have to adapt to the code editor. So that's point number 2. And point number 3 is, now that I have this code editor, I can actually start writing out some code, right? And in the case of this particular kind of code that I might be wanting to write in VS Code for the HTML is, okay, well, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that I can write the code necessary for, you know, building out a simple HTML page. So I'm just going to bring some in here real quick, and we can use that as a baseline to just kind of talk about the process here. So give me 1 second. And let's say that, because I don't want to have to type it all out, just be like, save some time here. Save some time and just do it like this. Let's do this. Not bad, y'all. Cool. So let's say I want to write a little bit of HTML in this particular file, right? We're going to talk a lot more about this in the next couple videos. First thing I'll put is like this little doc type HTML. One thing you can see is VS Code kind of adapts to the fact that I'm writing HTML, and it auto completes a bunch of my code, right? That's great. But next, I want to just paste this little bit of HTML in here, and then just to kind of give us the guidance of like, okay, I have some HTML that I'm working on, and yeah. So long story short, we're going to be writing some code just like this. So at this point, right, I have some code saved that I am particularly excited about. I'm like, oh, cool, I got some HTML in here, right? And the point of VS Code is for me to write these files, right? And to be able to say, okay, I have some code now written in this index.html file. I can save it. And the value now of me using VS Code is, as it saves, is going to save it specifically to that folder that I created before. And saving it in that folder, like that might seem like a very simple thing, but imagine when you're working on a project that has thousands of files, right? Code organization, that's step number 1 stuff, becomes super important, because how are you going to keep those files organized in a way that you're going to be able to work on, but not only you, like teams are going to be able to work on, right? It's easy when you're working by yourself, but you got to always think as an engineer, hey, somebody else is going to need to see this at some point, right? And if you do that, you're not only going to become a better engineer because you're going to write easier to read code, but you're also going to just have better organization for yourself in any way, right? Index.html is here. You know, maybe over time I might have a couple other files in here, like maybe like a styles.css, right? And as you can see, again, VS Code kind of adapted to the language that I was working in. So here it has this styles.css, and you know, I might have like just some simple CSS in here, and just kind of set the font color. Or my bad. My bad. Right. Set the color of this to like red or something like that. Right. Super simple CSS. This is maybe not the CSS I want, but again, the point is I'm writing code, I'm building files, right? I have 2 files worth of stuff to manage, right? And over time, this project might go from 2 files to 200 files, just depending on the nature of the project. You're going to write code that's way longer than you might ever expect, but you want to be able to organize organize it. So those are the reasons why I like to use VS Code. The third thing that you need to have as an engineer ready to work is being able to, now that you have files, now that you have the organization of files, and now that you have some code, right? Being able to manage that code and different versions of that code that you're going to be working on. That is where Git and GitHub come in. And as you can see, you know, like we kind of did a bunch of other stuff before we even got back to the place of talking about GitHub, right? And GitHub is, again, like that place where we're going to hold all of our code, the repositories of our code over time. But every code repository, here's a fun fact, every code repository that's on GitHub is literally just a folder, whoops, literally just a folder of some code files, right? So in the case of, you know, Target's repo for their code base, right? It is a folder that has a bunch of files of code in it. And then they push that file of code to the cloud and you can access it on GitHub. That is what all the files that you see on GitHub are, folders of code. So in order to be able to use that, you need to have a folder, you need to have some code, and then you got to be able to push that code to GitHub. So that's the third thing we're going to talk about real quick, is just the process of getting it onto GitHub. So GitHub is meant to be kind of a more secure place for you to store your code. And what GitHub does is it became a hub for projects that use Git. And Git is the more important concept that you got to understand when it comes to being able to start working on these projects yourself. I'm pretty sure this is the Git. Yeah. So Git is particularly its own tool that we use to organize and manage the different versions of code in our particular folders. So when somebody asks you like, okay, well, what's Git for? The literal purpose of Git is to manage the different versions of code or different versions of files that are stored in a particular folder. We call those folders of code repositories, and Git manages the changes or the differences in the files that happen over time in a particular folder. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. That's a pretty high level sophistication of what Git does, right? Git lets you manage the different versions of files that are going to be in a particular folder. If that makes sense to you, give me a thumbs up, because that's an important point. I'll show you exactly what I mean, and you'll be like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Thank you for the thumbs up. I appreciate y'all. Cool. So Willie's like, different versions of the same file? Yes, different versions of the same file or different versions of files altogether. So it's looking in that particular folder for changes. And it's like, oh, hey, these are the changes. The changes can be a particular file has been changed, or it can be, hey, you added some new files to this folder and we noticed that there's new files in this folder, or you deleted files from a folder. And now it's keeping track of every different version of the folder that you are saving over time. So the sponsor's coming soon. That'd be lit. Hey, that'd be lit. Hey, that'd be lit. That'd help me feed myself. It would though. That's not actually a joke. That would help me feed myself. All right, bet. So Git, right? So we use Git for the sake of managing the code that's in those folders. So the first thing you got to do in order to start managing the code with Git is download Git. So if you go to the git-scm website, again, I'll drop these links right after this stream. You can download Git for your particular operating system. So my operating system is a Mac. So I would go here, download this, and it'll start a whole download process and get things going for me. If you're on a Windows, it's a little bit of a different process because Git actually was built on top of, I'm pretty sure for Linux first. And then, you know, because of the different operating systems, there's different things you got to use to make it work for yourself. So on Windows, the download will download Git to your computer, but it also will download a different application that you use to manage your Git experience. That's called the Git bash. And the Git bash is essentially a place where you will be writing some of the commands that you're going to see me write in a second. So boom. So you download Git. That's step one from step three. So we're on step three. This is step one. You got to download Git. Once you have Git installed on your computer, in the Git bash or in a terminal window, you can confirm that Git is working. So you'd be like, okay, well, what's a command? What's like a command prompt or what's a terminal, right? A terminal is essentially a place where you can write commands specific to to your particular computer operating system. So I have a couple terminal windows up. This one is running actually a web application I'm working on. And then this one is a new one, right? So if I zoom in a little bit so you can see, right? This terminal is essentially holding me down and allowing me to type commands to my operating system, and then it will run those commands. So one of the things that I'm going to want to do is to confirm that Git was downloaded onto my machine. If you're on a Mac, you can use the terminal app to do this. I went through it real fast, but you can hold command, press the space bar and just type terminal and then press enter, and you should get a terminal window popping up. If you're on Windows, you should be able to get a command prompt up. It's called command prompt on Windows. So you hit the Windows and E, or hit the Windows button, and then in that Windows button, you can search command prompt, and you should be able to do the same thing. And on different Linux machines, it has different names, but you should look for something called command line, command prompt, or terminal, and be able to do this. But this is what the command prompt is good for, right? Is you can write different commands, and you should be able to see those commands give some output. So here, this is me confirming that the Git was installed on my machine by typing git -- version, and I get Git version 2.4. So clearly, I'm a little under what the current latest version is. So for y'all, if you don't have Git on your machine, you're gonna get the latest. And you can upgrade it also, but either way, you want a good, close to the latest version of Git on your machine. Now, let's go back to, for my sponsors at VS Code, another reason why I love VS Code, especially when I'm starting my beginner journey in tech, is VS Code makes it super simple to work with the terminal, right? If I go back to this VS Code window where I made my project folder and I have my files, right? I literally can get a new terminal by going up here to the top, clicking terminal and new terminal. And it'll literally pull up a terminal window for me to use right down here, which honestly, it makes my life easier to have everything in one place as an engineer anyway. So it's cool to be able to say, oh, I don't have to pull up a new terminal or command prompt. I could do it all right here. And if I wanted to check Git, I could do git -- version and have that here. I don't need the debug console in the way, right? So same thing, I could type and get that particular output. Which makes it helpful when you start using way more commands. It's like, oh, well, especially if those commands are going to do stuff to these files, it's like, why would I want to have a whole separate window when I could just do everything here? The caveat is also that, sometimes having everything in one window starts to get cramped, especially if you're one of those developers who your code is super long and you have other files you're going back and forth to. Sometimes it is helpful to pop out that stuff into the terminal. So the terminal is great to have separately if you want to have it as a separate window. But if you want everything kind of consolidated and have an easier place to see everything, you can do all of this in VS Code or an equivalent code editor, which is another reason why I like to use it. So boom, so cool. So first thing I needed to make sure I did was have Git installed. So I have Git installed, right? And now I want to use Git to manage these files and start to keep track of the differences and changes to the files. And so with Git installed, you can already do that, right? It makes it super simple to get started, right? The first thing you got to do in this process is initialize Git inside of your folder, right? So this is another reason why the step one, original step of creating the folder is super important. Because if we don't actually create a good organization for ourselves, we can't use Git effectively. It starts becoming difficult to use Git if you don't have a folder set up that is well organized, right? So going back to the first thing I told y'all is having a good set of folder organization is key to this whole process. So in the fact that I open this folder in VS Code, I now know that when I write this command, it's going to initialize Git in my folder for this particular project. Right? There's so many bugs that come up when you initialize Git in the wrong place, right? Let's say I initialize Git in a folder above this, in my desktop folder or something, right? Then I'm going to be seeing all types of files that I don't want to see because my project folder isn't actually the one that's using Git. And then imagine I have multiple projects. So I would want each project folder with the code that it has to be using Git, not my whole computer to use Git. Hopefully you get what I'm saying. No pun intended. So you want to make sure you're in the correct folder. So one way to do that is in the terminal, just look at what this, where it says you are, right? And so you can do that by looking to the left and seeing what is the name of this current directory or folder you're in. And another way is you can type the command pwd, which will show you the path that you're at right now, which will say, oh, you're at this particular folder. So I could say, oh, I'm on my desktop, I'm in the code projects folder, CMP 464, my project 0 stuff, intro to HTML, right? That's all right there, great. So I'm in the right place. So what I wanna do is git init in order to initialize a new Git repository in this folder. And really what initializing the Git repository is gonna do is inside of this folder, it's gonna start keeping track of the changes that take place inside of that folder. So as you can see, it started making changes already. It looked and saw, okay, here's 2 files that are now in this folder that have a U for untracked, meaning like, hey, we have files that we are seeing here that are different than what we started at. It started at nothing, but now it sees these 2 files. And it's like, what do you want to do with them? So with Git, you have the ability to say, hey, I want to track these files for edits. I want to make sure that these files are being tracked for changes. So anytime these files get changed, I want you to be able to see those changes. And you can do that by way of using a command in Git called add. Git add will allow you to specify particular files, right? So I can say git add index.html, and this will allow for this file to be added to the particular, the history that Git is going to keep track of for me, right? And so you can see now that this has an A for being added. I could do the same thing for the styles.css, but a little shortcut that we like to use in the developer land, especially when you have a lot of files, is you can use git add space dot to add all of the files inside of your current directory, right? So here now I got both of these files added, right? So that's the first thing, right? Is have Git, and I can add all the files in Git or add the folder that I want Git to start looking at, and then I can the second and third thing that Git does to help us manage these files and create that repository that eventually will be put on GitHub is commits. So you can think of a commit like, just show a thumbs. How many of y'all have played a video game where like at a certain point in the video game, you have to like stop and save the game to come back to it? You know what I'm saying? Like Pokemon or like Grand Theft Auto or, you know, something like, whether it's like, hey, you got to go back to a stash house to save, or like whether or not you can just, you know, press settings and press save, right? Like, y'all know those video games where like you've done a lot of stuff and then you got to save it, and you got to remember to save it, because next time you turn it back on, you're gonna be like, oh, I want to start where I finished, right? You can think of that being the same way that Git kind of works with your files, right? It's like Git will manage the histories, but you have to save the files into the history at different points to keep a version of the files at that point. So like I said, Git is what we call a version control software. It's a software for managing and controlling the versions of the code that you have in your files, right? In order to do that, you need to save the different versions of your code. It doesn't do it automatically. There's some commands you could use to make it do it automatically. We're not gonna get into that. I haven't even looked into that myself personally, but you could probably automate some of it. But at the end of the day, typically we don't automate it because you want to save specific snapshots of your code. And so you have more clarity on like which one you want to go back to or hold, etc. So to save a particular snapshot, to save the game, if you will, for your code, you want to use, first you got to add the particular files that you want into Git, right? A helpful command to use to make sure you have all the correct files added is git status, right? Git status will show you that which files are added into your project, and based on the project files added, right, it'll tell you, hey, you know, here's some files that have been changed or modified or whatever. And with that particular status, you can decide what you want to do, right? You can either add a particular file, or you can just ignore the files that haven't been particularly added. In this case, the .ds store isn't as important, so I'm not going to add it right now. But so just also to show you that you don't have to add everything. You can also ignore some files in your folder that you don't want to push to Git. And in that case, you wouldn't want to do git add dot, because that will add all the files, but you just want to add specific files that you want to keep track of. That's over. Once you've added the files that you want, right? to save the game, you got to use a commit. A git commit is essentially you saving your files at a particular version. So to make a commit, we use the git commit command. So we say git space commit space -m for a message. And then in quotation marks, we leave a message for the commit, right? So in this case, I'm making a commit and it's called right now initial commit. That just is going to be a helpful message for me to know, commit, initial commit with, I could say something like HTML and CSS file, right? This is an even better commit message because it gives a little bit more description as to what's going on in here. So imagine if I'm working with a team, this commit message will help my team know, hey, this commit that Cam just made is a commit with the original project files that we were using, right? That HTML file and that CSS file, right? Now that I have that commit, I have a history now of this particular saved version of the code. So to show you that, I can use the git log command, and it'll show you all of the commits that have been made. And it says here, who was the author of the commit, what was the time of it, and that particular version of the game that I saved, right? So that's it. That's all you gotta do, right? And ultimately, what happens is over time, your project's gonna change, right? Let's say, oh, I didn't actually like this styling. I didn't wanna have this initial CSS. I can do this, delete it, save it, and go back to Git and say, hey, now I'm ready to save the game again, right? So I could do git status to see what changed. It'll tell me what has been changed. I might do a quick git add dot to add all the files, git status one more time to just check a look at what changed. Okay, these have been tracked and now they're ready for me to commit. And now I say, okay, I have the files that have changed. I say git commit and I make a new message. So I might say removing bad styling from CSS, right? Save that, made that commit. And if I do another git log, I'll see now I have 2 commits in, right? I can use the arrow keys to go up and down and I can see, okay, now I have 2 commits in, right? One for that initial commit with the HTML CSS and another for removing the bad styling CSS. And now you might be wondering, okay, well, what's the utility of that? Well, the reason you are saving this is so that you can reference those other versions of code at different points in time. So let's say I create an error in my code and there's a bug now and I don't know why there's now this bug, which happens to all of us all the time, right? Having different versions of your code, especially versions that are working at different moments, becomes super helpful because then you can really quickly go back to another version of code. And to do that, you use some more sophisticated git commands to do that, to check out to a particular commit, et cetera. And I can address that in a different stream. But right now, I'm just showing you how to make these commits because they become very helpful as you go along in your project. So typically the flow that I have as an engineer starting a new project is step 1, create my project folder. Step 2, open that project folder in my code editor so I can start writing the actual files that are pertinent to my project. Step 3 is add git to my project files and to that particular folder and track all the files and make sure that I'm keeping references to the changes in those files over time as I'm working. The last thing that I would do, right, is push those changes, push that project to GitHub. And in order to do that, right, I need a project folder. I need a project folder that has Git initialized in it. So this particular folder's met those 2 criteria. And then I need to make sure I can push the folder to Git. There is a 2-step thing you got to do to push it to Git. I'm going to show you those 2 steps. The first thing is actually authenticating your computer with Git so that you can, or with GitHub, excuse me, so that you can actually push to GitHub. But the second thing is then being able to push it to GitHub. I've already done the first step, so I'm going to show you what it would look like if once you do the actual first step, which is getting your authentication together. But then we'll spend the last couple minutes talking about what you got to do to get the authentication working on your computer. So if I want to push a project to GitHub, right? Ultimately what you're going to end up doing when you have everything set up right is you're going to go to GitHub and you're going to say, hey, I want to create a new repository on GitHub, right? GitHub, basically, you creating a repository on GitHub is saying basically, I'm creating a new project that I want to save on GitHub. And really a repository on GitHub is just going to be a place where you can push any repository that you have on your computer. And so all you need is a repository name. So I could say intro to HTML, right? Sometimes I like to give it the same name as the one that I'm working on in my computer. Choose an owner, right? For you, if you have one account on GitHub, it'll only show you as the owner, which is fine. So put you as the owner, create a repo. Choose the privacy level. Public is great if it's not mission critical code. Private is better if you're doing like business stuff, etc. Some of these you can skip, like a README file is helpful at some points, but you don't really need to do all of this. So most times I come in, create the name of the repo, and just press create repository. And once that creates itself, it'll actually give you a couple steps that you can use to push the code to GitHub. And it's kind of funny because I don't particularly think that they do a good job helping new folks learn how to do this. So once GitHub sponsors me, I'd help them make this process better. But for the sake of right now, if you made a project, right? If you have a folder, you added Git into your project folder. Remember Git init, right? We initialized Git into a folder. Then you made some commits like we just did. We made a couple commits in our folder. Then the commands set of commands you want to use to get your project on GitHub are actually these three, right? These are the three commands you need from GitHub. You need to use to get your project to GitHub. This first example is like them kind of walking you through it as if you don't have a folder, you don't have a project, and etc. And it doesn't really help you know, like, hey, what are you actually doing here? So here you're actually creating a file called README, and you're making a commit. You're initializing Git, adding Git that README file, making a commit, and then doing a couple those three commands that you see at the bottom, which are what you do to help push your stuff to GitHub. So that's why I said it don't really make it easy for people who are new to understand, because you don't actually need to use all of those commands. You just need these three, but these three will only work if you did like we did and you already initialized Git in a folder, you already made the files, and you already added and committed the files. So as you can see, git init was the command we used originally to make our folder in our folder. And then we use git add to add those particular files in our folder. And then we did git commit to commit those files. One other helpful command to know that exists in the terminal is the history command, which will allow you to see the various commands that you've run. So I'll pull this up so you can see. You can ignore those other drawings, but here you can see when I opened the folder, right? I did this git init. I added that original HTML file. Then I did git add dot to add all my files, did git status to check them out, see what was happening, made my git commit, used the git log to kind of see those different logs on the file, git status again to just see what's going on, git add dot to add the files after I made those changes, git status again to see what was going on, and then git commit, last git commit, and then another git log, right? So you need to already have done a git init and a git add and git commit to be able to do these next three steps, which are basically connecting your local project to GitHub, changing the name of the default, files organization of your files in that folder. That's kind of hard to describe what a branch is without saying a branch, but and then pushing them. So I'll break these three steps down in like simpler detail as we do them. So the first thing is git remote add origin, right? This command basically says, hey, I'm gonna add a remote link to this particular Git repo. So remember, all the Git in the folder we're working in, right? So basically git remote add origin is going to allow me, I'll just copy this command and bring it over to my terminal, right? This command is going to say, hey, add a new remote link to this particular folder in VS Code that I'm working in. We're gonna call that remote link origin, and that link origin is gonna point to this particular URL, which is a GitHub URL that is created specifically for my repository. right? So I'm going to do this git remote add origin. That's basically linking my project on my computer to GitHub so that I can push those changes to GitHub. Then there's this command git branch -m main, right? What this is doing is GitHub not only allows you to keep track of all the versions, it allows you to separate the versions in what we call branches, which is a very sophisticated concept in Git. It's probably one of the more intermediate concepts of Git that is very helpful when you're working with teams. Is like you can have different branches of the same folder, so that let's say I'm working on this project with one of y'all, right? If I'm working on this with you, you might say, okay, cool. We have a Git repository. All of our files are being changed. But let's say I go home and I'm making a bunch of changes to the same files you're working in. That could mess you up, cause some conflicts for you. So what Git allows me to do is create a branch. So I can create a branch off of the folder that we're both working on. And now I have Cam's branch. And Cam's branch is where I'm making all my changes. And your branch is where you're making all your changes. So we're working on two completely separate branches of the same code. So later we can then push our changes back to the main project. But in the meantime, we can still be working on separate instances of the same code. So that's what this is doing, is just setting us up to have a branch to use called main. So it's saying we're going to send this code to one branch that we're going to call main, right? And then the last thing I got to do to push it to GitHub is git push -u origin. So I'm saying, okay, push the repo that is on my computer to main, right? So if I do this, now it's going to push it to GitHub. If I refresh here, I should see that folder's code inside of this particular repository in GitHub. And there it is, my index.html and my styles.css. And you can see I have two commits. Those are the same commits you just saw on my computer. Now they're here on GitHub, so people on my team or anybody interested can see those changes. And we can even review, hey, you know, what's changed in this last commit as opposed to the other one, right? So in that last commit, remember I deleted this particular set of code. So it's here, it's showing in red that I had deleted these particular lines of code. So Git is really, this is Git doing this, right? Git has all of that built in. GitHub is just a place for us to visualize all of the stuff that Git is keeping track of on our files. And then we can add other people to our projects in GitHub and they can work on the same project with us. So that's ultimately what you'll do with Git and GitHub on your machine, right? From the beginning, right? We created a new project folder on our computer, right? It was called Intro to HTML. That particular folder had two files in it that we created in VS Code, right? And once we made those two files, we were able to then set those files up to be managed in using Git and GitHub, right? So the three things you need to do to set up your developer environment is to create an organization for your files. So where are you going to save the code you're working on? Second thing is you got to write those code files. And so you need a text editor or some other application to write your code files. I like to use VS Code, like I told y'all. In VS Code, right, you create your files, you save your files to that particular folder. And then the third thing is you manage those files, right? So in this case, we initialize the Git repository in this particular folder, right? And in that folder, after we initialized the Git, we were able to keep track of all of the files inside of here and add them to be managed in the Git history, right? And added the files, and then we commit the files and change the files, add the files, commit the files, change the file, add the file, commit the file. That's literally the flow of using Git, right? As things change, you add the changes, commit when you're ready. Add the changes, commit when you're ready. And then when you have solid commits and you're like, okay, these commits are now ready for other people or for just like kind of safekeeping, that's when you might say, okay, boom, I'm going to push these files to GitHub. And to do that, you have to connect the GitHub repository to your particular computer's repository, and then push the changes, push those commits, I should say, push the commits you've made to the repo in GitHub. That's a lot, right? And I know that's a lot. So hopefully we can get some time to practice this, and we're going to have a lot of time to practice this. I'm going to keep coming back to it. But for the sake of closing out, I want to just kind of mention that really important step you got to take to get working on your machine. So there's two kind of paths you can take, and I'm going to talk about both paths. The first path is if you're working on projects, personal projects as an independent developer, and you just are like, hey, you know, I just want to be able to really quickly use Git in my command line, right? The other way is when you're working on more enterprise projects or like more sophisticated projects where security is going to become a big thing. And there's two different things you got to do if you're going to work on either of those projects. But long story short, in order to connect to GitHub, to push files to GitHub, we need to authenticate ourselves to GitHub. So I basically have to let GitHub know on my computer, hey, it's me, Cam, and I'm pushing files from my computer to you, to GitHub. That's what we got to do, right? And the two different paths I just talked about, there's two different ways that we can do that. If we're working on a personal project, the best way right now for you to work, if you're working personally and you don't really want to think about security stuff too much right now because the projects aren't as sophisticated, one way that you can do this is by creating what's called a personal access token on GitHub. And a personal access token is basically going to replace your password on the command line when you're setting up your authentication with Git. So Git's going to ask you, like, who are you? Like, it's going to say, who are you? And you'll be like, oh, like whatever your GitHub username is. Then you're going to say, okay, it's going to say, well, give us your password. And then you're going to give it this personal access token. So the type of token you're going to want to create is probably the fine-grained personal access token. There's also these older personal access tokens, but right now it's kind of unclear which one is going to be the one that they're going to lean in toward more. But personal access tokens is probably the best bet for now. So to create a personal access token on GitHub to use in your command line, here's what you got to do. You go to GitHub, make sure you create an account. Once you create an account, you're going to go to settings here, and got to move this Zoom thing out the way, and settings right here, right? And in settings, you'll see, if you scroll down to the left, there's these developer settings. And the developer settings has where you got to go to get the personal access token set up. So you click personal access token, fine-grained token here, and then you're going to want to just create a new personal access token, right? Generate new token. Here, you want to create a unique name for your particular token. Again, this is kind of going to be like a password. So you're going to want to keep this safe, but also use it in a way that's going to be helpful for you. So, you know, I might create this token and just kind of say, MacBook access, and then I'll just say like when I created this, so yeah, this is just giving me a kind of a unique token for that particular thing. Tokens, fine-grained tokens have these expiration dates to keep them secure. So kind of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever. It'll tell me who's the owner. And then here's the part that's important. It's going to say, which repositories do you want to give that token access to? Is it the public repos? So all public repos is going to be all repositories. So any ones that I make now or in the future, or only select repositories, right? If I click only select repositories, it's going to make me select the particular repositories that I want to give it access to. So I'd have to have that repo made for me to use this. The other option is for me to click all repositories. But again, that just means that now that same token becomes even more crucial for me to keep safe, because if somebody gets this token, they'll have access to all my Git repositories, both now or in the future, right? So you can manage the token here. So you can delete tokens, and it'll automatically delete tokens that have been around for over a year. But you got to choose what level of access you want to give. So let's say for right now, I want to give this token only access to that repository that I just made for the HTML situation. So I gotta find it. You can see how many repos I've made over time. That's kind of crazy. Made too many, right? But here I got it connected to that particular repo. So here maybe I'll change the name to be kind of Cam intro to HTML access. That's fine for now. It'll let me add some different permissions here for things like other features that GitHub has for you to use. I don't think we really need to worry about these too much. Account permissions. So right now it doesn't have really any account permissions. That's fine. And then let's see. Do I need to give the content? Read, write access, repository creation, deletion, settings, terms. So I might want to give it like read, write access and stuff like that. Let's see. I don't really see pull requests, related comments, signings, labels, milestones, and merges. So yeah, these are different levels of access that I can give this repo. So right now I gave it, let's say like read, write access on the administration level. So it can create repositories, delete settings, terms, and collaborators. I don't really know if I need too many of these. To be honest, this is my first time using the fine grained token. I'll give y'all some more details on it later. But the idea is the fine grained token will allow me to generate this token that will be useful for me working with that particular GitHub repo. So I'm gonna just do this real quick and later I'm gonna delete it because again, I don't even really use the fine grained token route, but I'm gonna show you the other route and you're gonna be like, maybe I do want to use the fine grained token. To use the fine grained token, you create that token like you just did. And then in the repository that we just created, so in my case, it was github.com, community, intro to HTML, right? Now in this repository, when I want to push to it, right, I would be able to push to it by way of using the HTTPS command. So again, when you saw me make these changes onto GitHub, I kind of went through it as if you already had it set up. But when you are working with GitHub, you have two options. One option is to use SSH, which is what I use to authenticate with GitHub. The other way is to use HTTPS. The way to use, when you're using HTTPS, is kind of easy because all you got to do is copy the HTTPS thing here. And then in that command where we did in VS Code, git remote add origin, somewhere here, right? Git remote add origin. You see, I had to copy and paste this particular URL. In SSH, the URL is going to look like this: git@github.com, my name, my repo. But then HTTP, right? I could do this also if I create a new repo. I'll show you all real quick. So, let's see. If I create a new repo real quick, this will actually make it really easy to show you the difference. So let's say intro to HTML2. Again, I just kind of create the repo. Select the owner. So, right. So whenever you create a repo on GitHub, you'll see this screen, right? And so I'll pause a little bit more on this screen right now. And this screen is the one we saw. There's those 3 commands we use, etc. But at the top here, I didn't really talk about this. At the top here, it tells you which kind of connection do you want to use to connect to GitHub. One is SSH, which I currently have selected as my default. The other is HTTPS. And as I click this, right, I don't know why it's not letting me click it. Oh, it did it. That's weird. The UI here is weird. Yeah, okay, whatever. So SSH, right, is this link. You see how the link changed, right? First, it was this git@GitHub thing, but HTTPS is now an HTTPS link. So it also changes these commands here to use that appropriate link. So most times when you first use Git in GitHub, it's going to have it on HTTPS, which will give you a link like this. So the git remote add origin is going to look like this instead of what it looked like down here, which is using that other URL. Hopefully y'all see what I'm talking about here. Right. So because of that, right, these are the 2 different paths. You got to determine which one you're going to take. Are you going to use SSH or are you going to use the HTTPS? If I were to have used the HTTPS, right, and I did git remote add origin, right, I wonder if I just do it on that project, if it'll actually show us this. Let's see what happens. So I'm gonna just put get remote add origin into here again. Oh, well, get remote, well, it doesn't make it easy here. So let's see, what can I do to make this experiment a little easier? So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm just gonna copy this folder over, just duplicate this. There's only a couple files, so it should be pretty quick. And then what I'm gonna do is just open this folder in VS Code for myself real fast. So I should open the new project folder in VS Code. And again, I'm just showing you this because once you choose which way you want to do on GitHub, it'll determine how you authenticate, and that process is in and of itself a little tricky. So here's that copy, right? The copy project that I have here. So what I want to do here is open a new terminal into that particular folder. And when that new terminal opens, the only other thing I want to do just to make it so I can show y'all this example properly is I actually want to remove the Git folder that probably got copied in here. So yeah, there's a Git folder in here that got copied in here. So what I'm going to do is just rm-rf.git just to delete that Git folder. So now if I did like Git status or something, right? It's going to tell me, hey, this isn't a Git repository, right? So here's actually another opportunity for me to show y'all from the beginning, what do we got to do to like make this a Git repository, right? And so clearly what I got to do is I need to initialize Git. That was the first step for this, right? So now I have Git in my folder. The next thing I want to do is I want to add the files that I have in this folder to make a commit. So I'm going to do a git add dot to make all of these files kind of in the history. So one more git status, right? All of these files are here. And then I'm going to make a commit. So git commit -m, and I'm going to say commit for test. Right? So I made this commit. And now remember, once you make commits, the last thing you do if you want to push those commits to GitHub is typically we're going to just do a git push. But I don't have this particular copy connected to GitHub. So that's where this comes back, right? So now I want to connect this to GitHub. So again, I will use this command, git remote add origin, to connect this to GitHub. And want to make sure, yeah, okay, I'm in the copy. So, oh no, this is the copy. This is the copy, right? So I want to make sure that I add this into the right place. So git remote add origin, right? As you can see, the difference is here it's using HTTPS, whereas before I was using SSH. So when I do this, it's like, okay, that's cool. And then second command, git branch -m. Remember, this is just kind of creating that branch for me, right? And then the last command is to push it. So when I do this command, hopefully it doesn't just do it, but when I do this command, it's gonna say, hey, it wants me to sign in using GitHub. I don't know if this is doing this only because I have the VS Code. I might have the VS Code GitHub extension. I'm not sure, but let's say it might do something similar for you. But either way, you're gonna need to authenticate with GitHub, right? So here it's gonna say, okay, boom, it wants me to connect to GitHub. Okay, let VS Code do that for me. And then I open VS Studio, and then I don't know what all this is doing. It's authenticating, and it made this push. Now, the thing is that those fine-grained tokens that I talked to y'all about, I think the VS Code extension actually just did it for us. It's maybe created a one-use token or something. But there's moments in time where this thing will ask you to authenticate only in the command line. And at that point, it's going to say something like, what's your username? And my GitHub username, I type cam unity and press enter. Then it will ask me for a password. And that's where that token that we created comes in. If it asks you for a password when you do this, the password that you're going to use is actually going to be that token that we created, that fine-grained token. So that's where you copy this, and then you go ahead and you're able to put it in as your password, and then everything should work. That's why I wanted to show you this. It didn't actually prompt me for it, which is annoying, but that's what you do if it did prompt you for it. SSH is the other way to authenticate. And to be honest with you, it is a little bit more sophisticated of a setup, but it allows you to, you don't ever have to do it more than once. Once you set up SSH once, you don't have to go in and make tokens. You don't have to like worry about the password or worry about somebody, this, that, and third, right? You have it all in one place. So I recommend, and I've done setup on SSH, but again, the process is its own video and link how to do it. And so I won't be able to show y'all it right now. But if you're interested, I could definitely drop the link. Just tell me in the chat that you want to know the SSH or send me a Slack message and I'll send it to you. I'll probably just drop it in the Slack. But these are the different ways that you can leverage GitHub for authentication and then push your projects to GitHub. Same situation here. Now, let me go back to this repo, right? And so if I refreshed here, you can see all my files are also here in this second repo using the HTTPS instead of the SSH. Little tricky, you know what I'm saying? Did I want to talk about this for so long? Not necessarily. But at the end of the day, hopefully you remember these three things because this is how we get these projects here on GitHub. First, we got to have good code organization, create the folders that we want. Second, we got to use VS Code or some other editor to make the files. Third, we manage the files using Git, and we can do that locally on our computer. And then when we're ready, we push it to GitHub to be managed in a separate way, right? Those are the three things, and we're going to be doing those things repeatedly in this course. So I know it might seem like, oh, that's like kind of a lot of stuff, but trust me, over time, more practice, more reps, we're going to get it going. So starting next time, we're going to be doing this in our code along. So hopefully keep along with me as we do it. But I wanted to give you this primer on like the three most important things to do to set up your dev environment. Make sure that you understand like, you know, how file system stuff gets structured, how to create these files with VS Code, and then how we might use Git in the future to